Back in 1986, Margaret Thatcher privatised and deregulated the buses. But this weekend, for the first time in nearly 40 years, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, is reversing that decision and bringing the buses into public control. If you're in Manchester, that means your buses are likely to get better, more reliable, cheaper, more frequent, more coordinated and easier to understand. And even if you're not in Manchester, this victory is one to celebrate because it means that we can build on this and campaign for better buses around the country. Welcome, everyone. My name's Kat, and this is We Own It Live. We're here because we believe... Okay, welcome, everyone. My name's Kat, and this is We Own It Live. We're here because we believe in public services for people, not profit, and we want to do something about it. And if you feel the same way, please do subscribe by clicking the red button and like this video. Thank you so much for being here. This is our first ever official YouTube Live. And please do put your comments and questions in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them in the Q&A. So I'm going to jump straight in talking to Matthew, who's our lead campaigner, who's leading our work for better buses around the country. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Kat. It's so exciting to be celebrating the launch of YouTube Live with a victory. That's such a fantastic way to be starting.
It's the perfect way, isn't it? So let's get started. So I think we'd like to talk a little bit about the history. So what happened in 1986, and then taking us through the past nearly 40 years now until the Greater Manchester campaign. So first of all, what happened in 1986? And just give us a sort of potted history of buses.
Oh, this is my favourite subject. So let me get straight into the detail. The first thing to say, before 1986, we'd had 50 years pretty much since around 1930 of successive governments, both Conservative, Labour governments, all backing the really simple principle that local buses should be controlled locally and in the interest of local people. And so all the networks were regulated, and that meant that services had to be registered with local authorities who were in charge of making sure services were of a good quality, but also they were very significantly publicly delivered. So either through council-owned bus companies or in more rural areas, there were a few nationalised bus companies as well to deliver services there. And then, of course, the 1980s, 1986, what does Margaret Thatcher do? She introduces one of the most extreme forms of privatisation that we've seen in this country and actually have seen anywhere in the world, where, first of all, any council-owned bus companies, they had to be pushed to being arm's length companies, so you couldn't actually control them as powerfully as before in the interest of local people. And then the market was created, a wild west where any private bus company could set up a route, they could cut a route, they could cut corners on reliability, they could hike fares. And suddenly there was kind of chaos around the bus network. And that ensued for several decades, meaning that publicly owned bus companies were increasingly run off the road by kind of dirty tricks in so-called bus wars with the private companies, leaving us over the course of these 4 decades with an ever worsening bus network, one of the worst networks across all of Europe. And that's where we have come to today. And hopefully on Sunday, we'll be starting the fight back and the return to a decent level of service.
Very exciting, because it's not actually normal, is it? This way that we run buses. If you compare it to how other countries do it, it's very different. So, you know, we know about Germany and Austria and France. You know, these other countries don't run buses in this slightly crazy way.
No, absolutely not. You know, it's always so interesting to me to speak to a whole load of transport campaigners of a whole load of different political backgrounds. And what they will all say is no one else in Europe has gone for this extreme form of privatization, which we call deregulation, this Wild West approach, where private companies are pretty much a law to themselves. Sure, they maybe have to send a piece of paper into somebody to say, oh, we're thinking of running this service. But apart from that, they pretty much get to do what they like. No one else is doing that. And in fact, most people go further than that. So increasingly in France, it's nearly always been the case in Germany, a lot of local areas award the right to run services in their local area, not to just some private company, but to a local publicly owned company as well, because they know that's the best way to deliver value for money and to deliver a really high quality service. The fact that we've got this system is a complete international outlier.
Totally. And I think one interesting thing that I always find interesting is the way that the competition authorities over the years have sort of looked at the bus market, quote unquote, and said, oh, it's a bit of a shame, isn't it, that bus passengers just get on the first bus that comes along, because actually the whole theory of trying to create this market is that we would behave like proper consumers. So we would sort of pick and choose our favourite bus company. Will it be Stagecoach? Will it be First? What would I rather? Let me pick my choice. But of course, yes, we get on the first bus that comes along because that's the normal way to behave. And yes, we've got a slide here. So a bit of a look at who owns our buses, the big five. And Matthew, you're very familiar with these.
Yes, these are the people who I like to spend my days trying to bring down, as it were. So across these folk, we've got a number of different bus operators. And one of the first things to draw out about Arriva, and actually some of the others throughout history, is that these are sometimes still publicly owned companies. They're just not owned by the public of Great Britain. And folk will be familiar with this across other of our services as well. I know Yorkshire Water, where I am, part owned by the Singaporean government. Cross Country Rail, which just this week saw its contract renewed, that owned by a foreign government as well. But Arriva Bus Service is one of the big five, providing a really significant proportion of services across this country, owned by the German railways, basically. And of course, that railway is publicly owned. So the government think it's fine for services to be publicly owned. They just don't think it's all right for us to own our own services.
Yes.
And to have that accountability. So that's one of the really striking things about Arriva there.
Yeah, as long as there's some kind of market, it's really crazy, isn't it? We've got a great comment in the chat from Jayanta, who says, given the reality of global warming means shared, convenient, efficient transport, it's vital to reduce individual car use. And obviously net zero has been a big theme this week, and buses are vital to tackling climate change and giving people a real alternative. So we've talked a bit about the history. Now, maybe let's just touch on the fact that it's not like this in London, is it? London's very different to the rest of the country because of the way that legislation was implemented in 1986.
Absolutely, Kat. And folk across the rest of the country will be quite familiar with this feeling where there's one thing that's all right for the rest of us, but London has been protected from what was, as they knew at the time, going to be a really kind of mad cat experiment with handing over control of services to private companies. And so they basically thought that London was far too important to subject to what they knew was going to be quite a chaotic situation. And so what we've seen is that London has doubled the number of people using the bus since 1986. And what has happened in other areas of the country? Well, it's halved. So we've got this really stark contrast between these two models. And it's not at all surprising, because what we see in London through public control is, sure, a general principle that it's designed in the public interest, but beyond that, services are integrated with things like the tube network or the trams, where there are in London, and with overground as well. But the tickets work simply across all services, and actually they're much better at guaranteeing reliability, because they're much better currently, although this wasn't always the case, at guaranteeing a certain level of provision through having enough drivers to deliver their advertised services.
Totally. And so London's public transport actually works, unlike pretty much all the other cities in the country. And there was a really interesting article in the Times recently, which said the UK's productivity is lagging. One reason might be this terrible public transport that we have in key urban centres like Manchester, like Leeds, like Sheffield, which means that the size of the city is effectively much smaller than it would otherwise be. Because if you look at the number of people in a city that can get into the centre in half an hour, it's much smaller than it would be if those cities had decent public transport. And so because productivity is so much about people connecting and combining in a city, it's actually affecting our productivity. So economy, environment, so many reasons to have better buses. So before we talk about the work that you're doing, Matthew, in pushing for better buses in these city regions, let's bring up the story of Better Buses Greater Manchester. So We Own It set up this campaign back in 2018, and we had a fantastic campaigner who led it, Pascal Robinson. And we've got a little video to share for you now of...
Here's how we won our buses back for us, starting in Greater Manchester. Thatcher deregulated and privatised buses everywhere except London. That's why London's buses are so much more successful than the rest of the country's. Deregulation means private bus companies decide their own fares, routes, timetables and ticketing. Our buses are a free market Wild West where bus company shareholders take home 148 million every year on average. If we were to re-regulate our buses, local authorities would plan the network, deciding fares, routes, drivers' pensions, bus colours, almost everything. Private bus companies would compete for contracts to provide our services. This is how buses are run in London and Jersey, and it works. London's bus use has doubled since the time of deregulation, while across the rest of the country, it's in decline. Re-regulation means you can use profits from busy routes to subsidise socially necessary routes, meaning all communities have a service, and companies can't just cherry-pick cash cow routes. It also means you can have a simple smart card which you can use on any bus, tram, train, which automatically caps your spend. This is impossible without regulation because bus companies aren't allowed to cooperate. 3/4 of us in Greater Manchester want our buses to be regulated. And now we have a chance to make that happen because Andy Burnham is deciding the future of our bus network. Regulation is a huge step towards public ownership because local authorities are deciding who runs our buses. Private bus companies don't like regulation because they tend to make smaller profit margins in a regulated network. But 40% of bus companies' revenue is public money, so why should so much of that go to shareholders? We need to use that money for more affordable fares and routes. If we can win here, it will set a precedent for the rest of the country to follow and show bus company fat cats we want buses run for passengers and staff, not shareholders. Which side are you on? Share this video so that Andy Burnham picks the right side and regulates our buses.
And we did win, which is so fantastic, such a clear victory. And talking to people behind the scenes about this victory, they said if it hadn't been for the Better Buses for Greater Manchester campaign that Pascal led so brilliantly, 2/3 to 1/3, they thought, these are some transport experts, I'm not going to say who they are, but they thought 2/3 to 1/3, Andy Burnham wouldn't have made this decision. But because of that campaign, it tipped him over the edge and it tipped him towards actually making this decision, which is quite a bold decision, really, to reverse the nearly 40 years of deregulation. So should we talk a bit, Matthew, about the kind of campaign actions that Better Buses for Greater Manchester did and how that led to victory?
Absolutely. So there was such a fantastic set of actions that Pascal and others in the region managed to bring together to push Andy Burnham and others to take this decision. One of the ones that I like best is that they held a Better Buses week where activists across the entire region got together. They wrote letters to their local council leader and said, we want to meet you at a bus stop so we can show you just how poor the quality of our service is. And just on that note, I saw a fantastic comment earlier in the chat, which said that lots of the people who rely on buses aren't necessarily those who are making the decisions themselves. And so that's one of the fantastic things the campaign did. They managed to force all of these council leaders to come to bus stops across the region and then have conversations with them, show them the reality of day-to-day life living with a privatised system. And by doing that, managed to convince them to put pressure on Andy Burnham as well. So that was one of the fantastic things that they managed to do to build up that momentum across the Greater Manchester region. Yeah,
it's a really good tactic, isn't it? I think getting a politician on a bus or on a train, or even, you know, checking out the public toilets, or, you know, whatever local amenities, the parks, you know, these are the public services. Are you happy to use them? And I think taking a politician on a bus is a really practical way of doing that. And I've had experiences of taking MPs on a train and getting them to sign something then and there when they're under pressure, which is quite a good tactic, I think. So yeah, that was brilliant. I also really enjoyed the bus, the queue at the bus action that Pascal organised, which made a terrific photo, which I think is the photo on this YouTube video. That was people queuing at the bus stop for Better Buses, which was fantastic. And of course, these campaigners were really up against it. And Pascal brought in a whole range of people into the coalition. They were really up against it, opposed to the bus companies, weren't they? Because Stagecoach and Rotala in particular ended up taking Andy Burnham to court to oppose franchising, and happily they lost. But that just shows the degree to which the bus companies didn't want this to happen, partly because it would reduce their profit margins, and they didn't want that, because under bus regulation, bus companies still make a profit, but it's much less. But also because of the precedent that it would set. And I think that's, and obviously we think it's set a precedent as well. And that's why we're campaigning for better buses around the country now. Because yes, okay, if they can do it in Greater Manchester, let's have it everywhere. We can have it in London, we can have it in Greater Manchester, we can have it across the country, and next stop, full public ownership. So, of course the bus companies aren't going to want that.
Absolutely. And one of the fantastic things that actually came out of them pushing so hard, ever so hard in the courts to try and fight this, is that they lost on all 40 counts when it got taken to court. There were 40 different ways they tried to stop this, and on all 40 of those issues, they lost. And so I think this just shows just how much work sure went in from Andy Burnham and others to put together an ironclad way of defending their decision to take buses into public control. But it actually shows, if you've got a politician in your area who wants to resist for some reason trying to take back their buses into public control, just show them actually the law's going to be on your side. That's what our experience has been today. So if you put the effort in and you fight for local people to have their services back under local control, then not only as that court case shows, are you going to win against the bus operators? But actually, let's draw out another factor of this story in Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham, when he was up for re-election in 2021, I think, he actually increased his vote share in every single area of Greater Manchester on the back of basically what an election that was seen as a referendum on taking buses back into public control. So this is vastly, vastly popular. So again, for anyone listening, this is a fantastic policy that you can really concretely fight to win. And there's a really great argument for any local politician. They will actually do quite well out of this. And that's what we've seen through Greater Manchester as well.
Yeah, completely. That's really interesting about the 40 counts on which all the bus companies were opposed and didn't win. They tried hard, but yes, a victory for public control. So what's happening in Manchester on Saturday? And I see we've got Ellie Harrison in the chat, who is the founder of Bring Back British Rail and also of Get Glasgow Moving, which is a fantastic campaign for better buses in Glasgow. And Ellie is also the creator of bus musicals. So there is a musical happening in Manchester on Sunday. I'm just answering the question that I've just asked. Musical happening on Sunday in Greater Manchester. We will pop the details of that in the chat. I believe it's at 3 p.m. And before that, we've got some other actions. And I'll hand over to you now, Matthew, to talk us through the day.
Yeah, so, I mean, you've got to celebrate a victory like this in style. And so we're doing a multi-part action, not just because we want to, for instance, show that this was something won by the people of Greater Manchester. We also want to use this as an opportunity to show practically what public control is going to mean if and when we win it in other areas. So this is something that's rolling out slowly across Greater Manchester. It's coming in thirds. And the first third of the region that's really being affected is that part out in kind of Wigan and Bolton. So at 12 p.m. on Sunday, we'll be having a photo call, a bit of a photo action outside the Bolton interchange. So this is a place where you can get off the bus and onto the train, all that sort of stuff. And that has just been freshly branded with this thing called the B Network logo, because in Greater Manchester, as they bring buses into public control, they are launching a new integrated transport system that they call the B Network. So 12 p.m, we're going to be taking a set of photos to celebrate this day outside that interchange in Bolton. And the way we're celebrating is we're throwing a birthday party for the B Network. And so I've had it arrive today. We've got a 5-foot birthday card, which I'm very excited to unwrap on Sunday, that we'll be using to mark this day, to celebrate it, and to show that it's something that's going to transform transport around the region and was won by people through public control. We'll then be riding in on one of the new publicly controlled buses. I'm very excited myself to get to use one of them. But it's not just any old bus. Through public control, the frequency of this bus, the number 8 from Bolton into Manchester, is increasing. So we're already seeing those tangible benefits for the people of Greater Manchester. So we'll be catching that bus into Manchester City Centre so that we can arrive outside Andy Burnham's office for 2 p.m. to have a quick rally to celebrate regulation of the buses in Greater Manchester. So we'll have speeches, we'll have some shouting. If you've got any thoughts for chants that you would be loving to be leading in Greater Manchester if you can't make it this weekend, do pop them in the chat, and I'll be making sure to get people shouting them outside Burnham's office, because we really want to have a celebratory atmosphere, because this is such a landmark victory. It's going to change the game because, as we've said already, 37 years Great Britain has been in this scenario where we're the kind of sick man of Europe again, where our buses are just so poor compared to everyone else. We are finally starting to win them back. And that's happening, as I say, Sunday this week. We've got to celebrate in style. So do come along if you can, between 12 and 3 on Sunday. That would be absolutely fantastic. And again, details in the chat if you want to be reading up a little bit more into the detail.
Brilliant. And will we be leaving the 5-foot birthday card with Andy Burnham at his office?
Oh, sadly, I would love to be taking it away with me, but we will be handing it in to the Combined Authority in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's representatives. We're going to have a quick walk at the end to actually hand it in at the TFGM offices, because no one's going to be in Andy's offices. But we're going to make sure we get it to him for Monday morning when he's launching the network through his own little event on Monday morning in Bolton. So we'll make sure he gets that card to thank him for the work, but also to mark the fact that this is something that he won in collaboration with the people of Greater Manchester, campaigning so hard for this victory.
Yeah, completely. And we were talking recently, weren't we, about how Andy Burnham could go further and how he could make sure that drivers' terms and conditions are good, which will help the reliability of the B network. Do you want to talk us through your thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a fantastic, fantastic change. It's going to, as I say, have some concrete improvements overnight, and hopefully will get us into a really positive cycle going forward. But one of the things that we potentially could be pushing for a little bit more from this system is to make sure that the terms and conditions of drivers are guaranteeing as a reliable service. Because for anyone who knows, like, it's all well and good having a really cheap ticket or having, you know, a good frequency on your local bus network, but if you can't actually rely that it'll turn up on time, then the whole thing actually starts to fall apart. And that's been a massive issue outside London recently, because we've had a big driver shortage. Why have we got that shortage of drivers? Well, it's because the operators have been trying to increase their profits by cutting down on the terms, conditions and pay of their workers. And so this is an opportunity, given we get to write into the contracts different rules that these bus operators have to follow under public control, to be ratcheting up paying conditions across Greater Manchester, which not only is the right moral thing to do. Driving a bus is a really difficult job. You've got to do customer service. You've got to look after people's safety. You've got to be driving quite a complicated vehicle. There's a lot to be doing. But actually, this is going to benefit us as passengers, because it means that we're going to basically stop trying to turn the tap on to get more drivers into the network while leaving the bath unplugged, because they are all leaving the workforce, because it is just not sustainable to live and work with those terms and conditions and with that pay. So by ratcheting it up, we can keep the workforce at a manageable level, and that means there are enough drivers to deliver the services that are timetabled, which at the minute there just aren't. So we really need Andy Burnham to be improving those terms and conditions, because that's how we're going to see, sure, a frequent, affordable network, but a reliable network as well. So a really, really important change that we've got to see there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and Liz says in the chat, yes, terms and conditions are crucial. So let's talk now about what's happening elsewhere in the country, because you've been working really hard on lots of campaigns. For people who don't know Matthew, he's always leading about 5 campaigns at once, because there's all these key city regions where we can be pushing for victory. So do you want to take us through, not necessarily all of them, although you maybe good to touch on all of them with a kind of whistle stop tour around the country? And actually, if we could get up the slide showing how we're taking buses back into public control, this slide is one that will show us. So it's actually highlighting some of the publicly owned bus companies, which is a slightly different thing. Those are left over from Thatcher's deregulation and privatisation, but also it's showing in the grey where buses are being franchised or could be franchised, and these are the areas that Matthew is working on.
Yeah, so this is so exciting for Sunday because there's those concrete improvements in Greater Manchester, but it's really the spark that's lighting something that's going to hopefully be a movement across the whole of of Great Britain at the very least, because there are campaigners that we're working with in some of these regions. So West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, where the mayors Tracy Brabin and Oliver Coppard are committed in their manifestos because of the campaigning of We Own It supporters and our allies. They've committed in their manifestos to taking buses back into public control. We're pushing also in other places. So in Liverpool, they've just finished a public consultation, which actually we saw just the other day, had 6,000 people respond to it, which is actually more as a proportion than responded in Greater Manchester. So a lot of excitement in Liverpool, obviously, for taking back buses as well. But there are fantastic campaigns springing up elsewhere. So there was a comment in the chat from Paul Smith, which was saying, we need regulated buses in Birmingham urgently. And what's really exciting is people have seen the campaigning that We Own It supporters have done in places like Greater Manchester, and they are wanting to start their own campaigns. So through a climate charity called Possible, they set up a campaign called Better Buses for Brum. And if you Google that, there'll be some links about how to get involved there. And they are fighting for buses to come into public control in that region. We have also worked with some fantastic campaigners in the west of England, which if people don't really know specifically what that means, it's Bristol and the area around Bristol. To have that Metro Mayor, the only Labour Mayor currently who isn't trying to take buses back into public control, start the process and begin moving towards buses that actually work in the interests of the people of that region. So this is something that is coming in across city regions all over the UK. And actually, as we get more devolution deals in rural areas, so in North Yorkshire next year, there will be the opportunity for rural places to be taking their buses back into public control as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. So do sign those petitions in the chat. And we've got lots of great comments here. So Rajni saying, can't believe who owns our buses. Mark liked that slide as well. And then we've got lots of comments from people saying what's going on in their area. So that's really interesting to see. And there's a question from Liz saying, I've lost it now, essentially saying if people are in rural areas or in areas where there aren't mayoral authorities, what can they do to get better buses? Which is a really good question. I wonder if you could answer that one, Matthew.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of different routes and I'd love to talk through them all, but maybe I should do some prioritization. One of the things you can do is that you don't have as easy a route to getting publicly controlled regulated buses as those metro mayoral regions do, but your council can go to government. This is written into the law. They can go to the government and say, we want to take our buses back, give us the powers. And if they provide enough pressure and enough of a compelling case to the Minister for Transport, the Minister for Transport can grant them those powers without having to go through the House of Commons. They can just sign a piece of paper and your council can get control back through that method. But there are some complexities around ownership of buses in the UK and our law, but there are some loopholes as well. Your council can buy an existing bus company. So maybe there's a little kind of family-run bus company business that, we think we're going to retire now and they're not going to have anyone to pass the bus service over to. Your council can buy that up. It's not affecting anyone locally. In fact, it means that they're going to keep being able to run those services. And they can then start to build that bus company up from something that's really small to something that's maybe on the size of Lothian Buses up in Edinburgh, which runs a fantastic service across the entirety of that city and is really one of the envies of the entirety of Great Britain. And so, from small acorns, you can grow into a mighty oak. And so that is another one of the pathways that you can take if you want to be getting back local control of your services and you're not in a metro mayoral region.
Yeah, so I didn't realise this, Matthew, till you told me the other day, because obviously We Own It was here when the 2017 Bus Services Act was passed. And because they were increasing powers for regulation of buses, they also threw in a ban on new publicly owned bus companies. So councils aren't allowed, because of that law, to set up new publicly owned bus companies. But I didn't realise there was this workaround where they could nevertheless buy up a company and run it, which is kind of cool. So that's good to know. And Ruth asked in the chat, once in public control, how can we keep them? Which is another good question, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the perennial questions of protecting our publicly owned or publicly controlled services. And I'd be really interested, Kat, what your thoughts are, kind of thinking maybe across other sectors as well. But with our buses, I think one of the most important things is to build up a real sense of love and loyalty within the community. Now, I know that can sound a little bit daft, but an example I want to bring in is actually from the water industry, where they tried to privatize all of Great Britain's water. They got away with it in England and to a slightly lesser degree in Wales, but it's still effectively privatized. They didn't get away with it in Scotland. And the reason that is because the council ran an unofficial referendum on the question, do you want Scottish water to be sold off? One of the councils around, I think it was around Strathclyde and kind of Glasgow. And they ran this unofficial referendum. Of course, the vote came back, massive turnout, massive, no, we don't want you to sell off our publicly owned water. And that's why Scottish water is still in public hands. So make sure that the people in your local area know that they own their buses, know what that delivers for them, and make sure that they're ready to get organised to defend it and preferably also to mobilise their local authorities to defend it as well. So I guess that's one of the thoughts that really immediately comes to my mind. I don't know if you've got any thoughts there as well, Kat.
Yeah, I mean, so we produced a report called When We Own It in 2019 when Labour was talking about democratic public ownership, what should that look like? And that report's on our website. And it's also speaking to this question in a similar way, talking about how we can grow that love and loyalty towards local public services by really getting people involved. And there's a question from David in the chat: in what form would public participation look like in a publicly owned bus service like Manchester? So at the moment, I don't know if there's public participation expected as part of Andy Burnham's B network. But what we said in our report was that you should have more public involvement. And so having a voice for the people who use public services alongside the workers, alongside community groups. So, you can imagine that in the case of buses, you have passengers saying, oh, can we feed in here? This is what we need. And actually sitting on boards and being part of the governance structures to hold publicly owned bus companies to account. And I think that's really important. And so hopefully you end up in a situation where we have full public control and public ownership. You have a public voice in there. The services are getting better, and people can see that, and they think, well, why? Obviously, we're not going to go back to the bad old days of the crazy experiment of Thatcher. That would be madness. So I think that's part of it too. So yes, lots more good comments. Jen says, can you get together with Jamie Driscoll? He wants what you want in the Northeast. Are we thinking about the Northeast, Matthew?
So one of the things is I have already got together with Jamie Driscoll. Last year at Labour Party conference, we had a quick conversation at the end because I was so keen that someone who is quite often doing really innovative, really good devolution policy knew that they needed to be cracking on with taking buses into public control. And unsurprisingly, when I spoke to Jamie, he said, yes, this is absolutely on my agenda. And so there's a really positive set of opportunities there. There are also some fantastic transport users group up in that region, particularly around Newcastle. And so I think we definitely want to be kind of turbocharging that desire in the kind of Northeast, the new Northeast devolution deal, to make sure that across what is a really fantastically large area, we're getting all of those buses back into public control as soon as possible. So I think, yeah, we'll be looking to link up more in the run up to the election next year.
Brilliant. And Ellie says, better buses for Strathclyde launching next Friday, the 29th of September. So that is very exciting too. Fantastic. It's so brilliant to be celebrating with you all this amazing victory in Greater Manchester. Next stop, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Liverpool, Bristol, and so on around the country. Thanks for all of your brilliant comments and questions and for being here. Please do subscribe if you haven't. and like this video. The more that you engage with this video on YouTube, the more people will see it, the more people will reach with this message. So we're really grateful to you if you're able to do that and spread the word about publicly controlled buses and public ownership. We've got links in the description. If you're around Manchester on Sunday, or if you can make a trip, we would love to see you there on this wonderful magical mystery tour of buses and handing in this big birthday card. And actually, we forgot to mention that Matthew on Monday, I think, will have a coffin for the death of deregulation, travelling on a bus across the country. I'm right, aren't I, Matthew? We haven't changed the plan. We've got that coffin.
No, we've got a whole set of activists travelling back with me from Bolton to Leeds to hand in this prop to Tracy Brabin to put pressure on her and show that, you know, this is a done deal. Devolution, or rather devolution, is going to end the experiment with deregulation. That is just going to happen. So she needs to crack on, kind of put her foot on the gas and really push forward so that we get those buses back to public control as soon as possible in West Yorkshire.
It's good. We just chucked in a little bus pun at the end there. Always good when you're talking about transport. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And we'll be back on YouTube at 5 p.m. next week. And we hope to see you then. Thank you.